Silicon Valley, a place where dreams are built, fortunes are made, and just as easily, everything can be lost. It's a land of relentless ambition, brilliant innovation, and unforgiving competition. Behind the sleek glass buildings and billion-dollar valuations, there are stories. Stories of triumph, yes, but also of brutal downfall. And at the heart of one such story stands David Harris, the CEO of Innovate Tech, a man who spent 2 decades building an empire only to watch it collapse in the blink of an eye. David's story didn't begin with luxury or privilege. He wasn't born into a wealthy family in some sprawling mansion on the California coast. No, David grew up in a modest neighborhood in a small town near Sacramento, where life was simple and opportunities were rare. His parents were hardworking but ordinary. His mother a schoolteacher, his father a factory worker. There were no powerful connections waiting for him, no golden safety nets. But what David did have was a mind that refused to settle for ordinary. From an early age, David was captivated by computers. By the time he was 12, he had already built his first rudimentary software program. Nothing groundbreaking, but enough to light a fire in him that would never be extinguished. Technology, to David, wasn't just a tool, it was the future. It was possibility. After high school, he earned a scholarship to Stanford University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, right at the doorstep of Silicon Valley. At Stanford, David thrived. He immersed himself in computer science, but more importantly, he learned about business, leadership, and the volatile ecosystem that powered the world of tech startups. He understood early on that coding alone wasn't enough. To truly make an impact, he needed to build, to lead, and to innovate. Upon graduation, David rejected offers from major corporations like IBM and Oracle. Instead, he took a risk, joining a tiny startup that hardly anyone had heard of, Innovate Tech. At the time, the company operated out of a cramped office above a coffee shop in downtown Palo Alto. There were fewer than 10 employees, most of them fresh out of college, armed only with ambition and a dream. David started as a junior software developer, but it didn't take long for his potential to shine through. Within 5 years, he was leading major projects. Within 10, he was sitting at the executive table. And by the time Innovate Tech started to make headlines for its groundbreaking innovations in cloud computing and enterprise software, David was the obvious choice to become its new CEO. Under David's leadership, Innovate Tech didn't just grow, it exploded. Within a few short years, the company was valued at over $10 billion. Their technologies changed how companies operated across the globe, making processes faster, smarter, and more efficient. David was hailed as a visionary, a man who could see where the world was going long before anyone else. But success, especially in Silicon Valley, is a double-edged sword. The higher David climbed, the more enemies he made, some quietly resentful, others openly critical. Inside Innovate Tech, cracks were beginning to form. While David was celebrated for his ambition and boldness, not everyone agreed with his aggressive strategies. Sarah Nolan, the company's vice president of finance, was among the first to voice concern. A cautious and pragmatic leader, Sarah believed Innovate Tech was expanding too quickly, taking on too much risk without enough safety nets in place. She warned that the rapid growth could lead to instability, but David, confident in his vision, often brushed aside these concerns. He wasn't reckless, he believed. He was simply refusing to be left behind in an industry that rewarded speed over caution. Beyond Sarah, a younger generation of executives and board members also began to question David's leadership. They saw him as a relic of an earlier tech era. Brilliant, yes, but perhaps too stubborn to pivot with the evolving digital economy. The board of directors, once fully loyal to David, had grown more divided. Some still admired him for all he had built, while others whispered in private meetings that it might be time for new blood at the helm of Innovate Tech. Still, to the public and media, Innovate Tech was a shining star, and David Harris was its guiding light. He graced magazine covers, gave keynote speeches at the world's biggest tech conferences, and was even rumored to be in talks with top political leaders about the future of technology policy. David had become not just a businessman, but a symbol of American innovation, the kind of person others pointed to and said, "This is what success looks like." Yet behind the scenes, the foundation was beginning to crack. David, so focused on the next big idea, didn't realize just how fragile his position had become. His once untouchable reign was increasingly vulnerable, not because he had lost his edge, but because the political tides inside Innovate Tech were shifting against him. A series of small mistakes, minor disagreements, and whispered doubts were beginning to pile up. In Silicon Valley, where fortunes rise and fall in a heartbeat, it wasn't the massive scandals that destroyed careers. More often, it was the slow erosion of trust, the subtle loss of political capital, the unseen alliances forming in the background. And so, as David sat in his spacious corner office on the 45th floor of Innovate Tech Tower, overlooking the bustling streets of San Jose, he had no idea that his greatest challenge wasn't out there in the competitive market. It was inside his own walls. He didn't know yet that the next decision he made, a seemingly small and harmless choice, would set off a chain reaction that would tear everything apart. David Harris was a king atop his mountain. But in Silicon Valley, kings fall fast. And fall hard. It all started on a Thursday morning. The kind of morning that felt no different from any other. Clear skies, a gentle breeze through the windows of Innovate Tech Tower, and David Harris, as always, arriving early before most of his executive team. That day, the company's HR department had brought forward a minor issue. An employee dispute involving one of the junior developers, a talented but hot-tempered coder named Mark Sullivan. Mark had been involved in a heated argument with his team leader over project deadlines. He had also reportedly sent a few harsh emails, nothing too extreme but enough to warrant official attention. To David, it was a trivial matter. These things happened in tech companies all the time. Stress, long hours, passionate disagreements, they were part of the culture. Rather than launch a full investigation or escalate the matter through layers of bureaucracy, David made a snap decision: suspend Mark for 2 weeks without pay. In his mind, it was a simple disciplinary action, a minor setback for Mark, a reminder for the team to stay professional. David didn't see any reason to involve the board or the HR executives further. He had made dozens of decisions like this before without issue. But this time was different. Mark Sullivan, it turned out, wasn't just another junior employee. He was the nephew of Richard Cole, Innovate Tech's chairman of the board, and a man whose influence inside the company had been quietly growing as David's authority began to wane. Richard, who had largely stayed out of day-to-day operations for years, saw David's suspension of his nephew not just as an overreach, but as a personal insult. He wasn't outraged because he thought Mark was blameless. No, Richard was furious because David had made the decision unilaterally, without consultation, without deference to the intricate political web that now existed inside Innovate Tech. To Richard and his growing circle of allies on the board, David's action was a glaring symbol of a deeper problem. David Harris had stopped listening. He had stopped respecting the evolving power dynamics inside the company. He still believed he ruled Innovate Tech as he had in its early days, with bold, independent authority. But Innovate Tech was no longer a scrappy startup. It was an empire. And empires are not ruled by kings alone. That afternoon, behind closed doors, Richard met with several key board members. There was no shouting, no dramatic ultimatums. Just a quiet, careful conversation about leadership transitions, long-term company health, and the need for fresh perspectives. By the next morning, the plot had been set in motion. David had no idea. He went about his business as usual, attending meetings, approving budgets, sketching ideas for a new AI project he hoped would revolutionize cloud security. He still believed Innovate Tech was fully his to shape. Meanwhile, Richard Cole and his allies were already drafting the letter that would end David's reign. It wasn't just about Mark Sullivan anymore. It wasn't even about the decision to suspend him. It was about a CEO who, in the eyes of the board, had become too powerful, too stubborn, too disconnected from the realities of a corporation that had outgrown him. And so, from a tiny disciplinary action, a 2-week suspension, the walls of David Harris's empire began to crumble. He didn't see it coming. He couldn't. Because when you've ruled for so long, you forget that even the smallest crack can bring down the tallest tower. Monday morning came faster than David Harris realized. He arrived at Innovate Tech Tower sharp at 7:30 a.m., just as he always did, believing it would be another ordinary week of innovation, meetings, and ambitious plans. But the energy in the building was different. The front desk receptionist, usually cheerful and quick to greet him, barely met his eyes. The executive assistant, who had served him loyally for years, seemed unusually distant. David brushed it off. Everyone was probably just exhausted after a big product launch the week before. He made his way to the top floor, coffee in hand, planning to dive into his agenda. Instead, he found a terse email waiting for him. Mandatory emergency board meeting. 9:00 a.m., conference room A. David blinked. Emergency meeting? There had been no notice, no preliminary briefings. That was highly irregular. A slight unease began to creep into his chest, but he shook it off. Maybe it was about a cybersecurity issue or a financial concern. He spent the next hour pacing his office, staring out over the San Jose skyline, unaware that his fate was already sealed. At precisely 9 a.m., David entered conference room A. The entire board was already there. Richard Cole sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Surrounding him were the board members David had once considered his allies. Some nodded at him politely, others refused to meet his gaze. The room was heavy with silence. David took a seat at the far end, trying to read the tension in the air. Richard was the first to speak. "David," he said, voice calm, almost clinical. "We've called this meeting to discuss the leadership and direction of Innovate Tech." David felt a sudden, sharp jolt of realization. This wasn't a discussion. This was an execution. One by one, board members laid out their concerns. They praised his legacy, his achievements, his visionary leadership. But then came the words that cut deeper than any blade. "It is the board's belief that a new chapter requires new leadership." David fought to defend himself. He cited financial reports, product successes, client expansions. He reminded them of where Innovate Tech had been when he took over, a struggling startup, and where it stood now, a global giant. But it was useless. The decision had been made before he even walked into the room. When the vote came, it was swift and brutal. Unanimous. David Harris was officially removed as CEO of Innovate Tech. Security personnel were already standing quietly in the hallway, ready to escort him out. No grand farewell, no press conference, just a quiet, clinical erasure. As he was led past the rows of employees he had once inspired, David realized how quickly power in Silicon Valley could shift. One day, you're the king. The next, you're a ghost. After his removal, David Harris disappeared from the spotlight. No interviews, no public statements, just silence. The media speculated endlessly. Was he planning a comeback? Would he sue Innovate Tech? Would he start a new company? David did none of those things. Instead, he moved into a quiet house on the outskirts of Napa Valley, far from the fast-paced world of Silicon Valley. Days that were once packed with high-stakes meetings and global strategy sessions were now spent tending to a small vineyard, reading books, and reflecting on a life that had moved too fast for too long. The transition wasn't easy. For months, David struggled with feelings of anger, betrayal, and overwhelming loss. He had poured everything into Innovate Tech, his energy, his ideas, his soul. Watching it continue without him was like watching someone else live in the home you built with your own hands. But slowly, painfully, he began to heal. He started teaching business ethics at a local college, mentoring young entrepreneurs who reminded him of the ambition he once had. Not the reckless ambition of chasing glory, but the pure ambition of creating something meaningful. In conversations with these students, David realized something profound. His true legacy wasn't Innovate Tech. It wasn't the billions earned or the technologies invented. It was the lessons he could pass on. The understanding that success without humility is hollow, that leadership without listening is doomed, that no amount of achievement can shield you from the consequences of small mistakes left unchecked. David had lost a company, but he had found wisdom. And sometimes wisdom is the most valuable asset of all. Introduced as Innovate Tech moved quickly to rebrand itself after David's departure. The new CEO, Madison Cole, Richard's daughter and Mark Sullivan's cousin, was the fresh face of the company. Young, dynamic, and media-savvy, Madison represented a new generation of leadership that emphasized inclusivity, collaboration, and corporate responsibility. Publicly, Innovate Tech thrived. Their stock prices soared, they launched new initiatives in artificial intelligence and environmental sustainability, and the media praised their transformation. But behind the polished image, cracks began to form. Internal reports surfaced about confusion at the leadership level. Innovation slowed. Employees who once thrived under David's bold vision now struggled under endless committee meetings and cautious decision-making. Some clients whispered that Innovate Tech had lost its edge, that it was no longer the disruptive powerhouse it had once been. In private, even some board members who had voted for David's ouster began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late. The king was gone, and the new regime had to live with the consequences. A year after the collapse, the tech world had almost forgotten David Harris. Almost. But in a small, sunlit co-working space tucked away in downtown Santa Cruz, far from the towering offices of Silicon Valley, David was quietly building something new. This time, it wasn't about billion-dollar valuations or global domination. It was about meaning. David had founded a non-profit initiative called Next Bridge, focused on mentoring young entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities, kids who, like him, had grown up far from privilege, kids with talent and fire but no roadmap. He spent his days not in boardrooms but in classrooms and community centers, teaching hard-earned lessons about innovation, leadership, and most importantly, humility. He taught them how to dream big, but also how to listen, how to build trust, how to lead with heart instead of ego. He told them about his failures more than his successes. He told them how easy it was to lose yourself chasing a crown that ultimately meant nothing if you stood alone at the top. Word about David's new mission began to spread quietly, not through press releases or flashy campaigns, but through the students he mentored, the small businesses he helped launch, the communities he strengthened. Slowly, a different kind of empire was rising, not made of concrete and code, but of people, dreams, and hope. And although David never again commanded massive companies or graced the covers of tech magazines, he found something far rarer: peace. In a world obsessed with speed, he learned the value of patience. In a culture that celebrated winners, he embraced the beauty of resilience. In a society that worshipped the new and flashy, he rediscovered the quiet strength of staying true to oneself. One evening, after a long mentoring session at a local high school, David sat alone on a bench overlooking the ocean. He watched the waves roll in, constant and unbothered by the chaos of the world. For the first time in a long time, he smiled. Not a forced smile for a camera or a polite smile for a boardroom, but a real, unguarded smile. Because he knew now, he hadn't truly lost everything that mattered. He had simply made room for something better to begin. The king had fallen, but the man had risen, and that made all the difference. Failure. It's a word Silicon Valley claims to celebrate. Fail fast, fail often, they say. But when real failure comes, it doesn't feel like a badge of honor. It feels like loss, like betrayal, like standing alone in a place you once ruled, wondering where it all went wrong. David Harris learned that the hard way. In the sterile conference room where he lost his throne, in the empty offices he left behind, in the headlines that barely mentioned his name anymore, he faced the raw, painful truth of what it meant to fall. But he also discovered something deeper, something no success had ever taught him. He realized that failure isn't the end. It's a mirror. It shows you who you really are, stripped of titles, stripped of power, stripped of applause. And what David saw in that mirror wasn't a broken man. It was a man finally free from the chains of ambition he had once worn so proudly. A man who could finally live for more than just the next big win. He understood now that legacies aren't built on uninterrupted victories. They're built on how you rise after the fall. How you rebuild, not your career, but your character. How you choose humility over pride, growth over bitterness, hope over regret. David Harris's empire had crumbled, but the lessons he carried forward were more powerful than any empire he could have built. He became a symbol, not of invincibility, but of resilience. Not of endless success, but of meaningful survival. In the end, Silicon Valley moved on, as it always does. New CEOs rose. New companies exploded onto the scene. The world forgot the man who had once stood at its cutting edge. But David didn't need the world to remember him. He had already won something far greater. He had remembered himself, and in a world obsessed with chasing the next big thing, sometimes the greatest triumph is learning to stand still, breathe deep, and be at peace with who you are, no matter what you've lost. That is a story worth telling.